Okay, well, today is session 24, April the 4th, 2023. Spring is trying to break out all over. Tell you just a little funny joke before we get started. Last week, Houston Church hosted this association meeting, and Braden Barnum was the last speaker, and he always listens to mine and Mike's Truth Be Told. And he's teased us for several months now. One time I was on the phone with him and he said, yeah, I listen to Truth Be Told. He says, people ask me what it's about. And I say, well, it's two old guys talking about politics and the weather. So he gets up to preach a sermon and he's recommending Truth Be Told to everyone. He says, I think you all ought to listen to it. He says, in fact, the introduction of my sermon is, today is a high of 65 and tomorrow's going to be 63 and possible rain in a few days. And that's how he started the sermon, trying to tease us how we start. But I just told him that's what old men talk about. I talk about the weather. Anyway, the subject tonight is really quite interesting. I've never heard anybody bring a lesson or sermon just on this subject. This is a subject that is often said in passing in connection to other subjects, but to deal with it as a separate subject, maybe you have. I've never taught a lesson strictly on this part of it, and there's a lot in the Bible about it. I'm only going to bring up a certain number of verses. Maybe you'll find some more on your own. But I call it a closer look at Matthew 24, 6 through 8, and 24, 29. So why don't we read those, Matthew 24. For the last, 6 or 8 sessions, supposedly we've been in Matthew 24, but we went over and spent a lot of time in Daniel and other places. So I'm coming back to Matthew 24. My goal is we've dealt enough with what is in this chapter, even though we haven't stayed in this chapter for 6 or 8 sessions or so, that the next session before our trip, I'm hoping to do like a summary of the whole chapter. That way, by the time I leave, Matthew 24 will be behind us and we'll move on to other things. But in Matthew 24 and 6, you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various, or I like the old King James, diverse places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. And then verse 29, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. So I call it a massive upheaval, both physical and spiritual. And what I'm hoping to accomplish tonight, even though we're going to be looking at signs in the heaven and signs on the earth, what all is going to be happening to physical creation above us and beneath us is a reflection of what will be happening to the nations, to families, to peoples, to individuals, to human beings. In the verse I have up at the top, I will show wonders in heaven above and signs in the earth beneath. And there's going to be both. And I underlined I will because it's God who will be doing it. A lot of times we make the mistake when we're studying the tribulation and all the events that are happening. We tend to think most of it is caused by humans with our military weapons doing battle with each other. And that will be a key factor to it. But the Bible seems to say that the vast majority of it is going to be directed from heaven by God, in the heavens and on the earth. So a lot of natural disasters that are caused by God. And so when Peter quoted Joel, this is from Joel 2:30, In Matthew, or I mean in Acts 2:19, it uses the word vapor of smoke. Ruth, would you mind reading in the New American Standard? Because vapor, the word translated vapor is one of those words that could be translated by a number of English words. In fact, the quote from Joel, in the book of Joel, it says pillars of smoke. Now, when we think of pillars of smoke, in our day, we think of nuclear weapons, atomic weapons. And that certainly is going to be a part of it, no doubt. But for the rest of history, in the time it was written in the Bible up until atomic and nuclear weapons, that would have been thought of as volcanoes. And I think volcanoes will be a huge part of the natural disasters going on during the tribulation. Ruth, what does it say in New American Standard?
And I will grant wonders in the sky above and signs on the earth beneath, blood and fire and vapor of smoke.
Vapor, so they like vapor. And then I add Luke's version of Matthew 24 is Luke 21 and verse 11. There will be fearful sights and great signs. And you notice it says from heaven. So it's from God, directed toward his creation. There's a verse in Colossians that says that Christ, in him all things consist. And that word consist can be translated more literally as held together. And I really think what the Bible is describing is that to some degree, God will be loosening the grip on his creation. And we are going to find out what creation will be like without God holding it all together. And another verse I'd like to add here, besides Luke 21:11, we'll turn over and read that because it's a real interesting verse. Luke 21 and verse 25. Luke 21:25. And there will be signs in the sun, in the moon, and in the stars, and on the earth distress of nations, with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring. Now, this is one of those phrases that I think is both literal and symbolic. The sea and the waves roaring. Because if there are natural disasters, we're going to read a number of verses that talk about major earthquakes. What happens when you have major earthquakes? You have tsunamis and you have volcanoes. And I think all three of those things are going to be in action. So the sea and the waves literally will be roaring with tsunamis. We're going to read a few verses in Revelation that says at some point, the islands will flee away. Well, what does that mean? It's probably large tsunamis are going to finish off a bunch of small islands around the world, maybe even some large islands. It's going to be a time of disastrous natural phenomenon that God is directing. But also the sea and the waves roaring is symbolic of the chaos and confusion of the human race at that time. That's why it says with perplexity. The creation is not perplexed, but humans are perplexed. What's going on? Who's causing it? Where is it coming from? What are we going to do about it? We thought in this age of AI and technology that we had the answers to all of our problems. And now everything's falling down around us, and we don't have an answer to it. What are we going to do? We're not as smart as we thought we were. We're not as powerful and rich as we thought we were because we're not able to hold it all together. And so the sea and the waves roaring, because Revelation 13:1 says the beast comes up out of the sea. And as I've often said, that's not Godzilla coming up out of the ocean at Tokyo. You know, it's not the literal sea. The sea in the Bible often represents the tumult, the confusion of the human race. And so when this says the sea and the waves roaring, I think it's literal with natural disasters, and it's symbolic, reflecting what's going on in the human race. Or let me say it this way, because one of the main points I'm trying to get across tonight is that the upheaval in creation will reflect the upheaval in the human race. They'll be kind of mirror images of each other, which is natural if you're going through those major. We've seen the last couple of weeks the tornadoes in Mississippi, tornadoes in Little Rock, flattening entire towns, killing dozens of people. Of all the natural disasters, that to me, that's the scariest, to see a tornado coming at you. And you can't really do a whole lot about it. We don't have basements here in California much, so we just have to do the best we could. With Christ's first coming, there was a celestial sign at his birth, the Star of Bethlehem. And we study, we research, who are those wise men? Really, what, a star stopping over a manger? I mean, it's a star. How can it stop like right over a manger when it's like, a billion light years away? Well, maybe the star came down low. Well, okay, then maybe it wasn't a real star. We go over all these things. So it was a miraculous event leading those wise men to find Jesus actually in his house, not over the manger. And then terrestrial signs at his death, earthquakes and darkness. And I give the verses there where it talks about total darkness from noon to 3. And by the time the light came back, he was dead. In 2751, the earth quaked, the rocks quaked, and the graves were opened. And so, those are like first fruits, a down payment, or showing at his first coming what's going to happen in a much larger scale at his second coming. Verse where I read in the beginning, 24:6-7a, I think this is important to bring out, especially verse 7. Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. So let's just stop there for a minute. If you really look at Matthew 24, Jesus is not giving a lot of new information. He's grabbing bits and pieces from the Old Testament prophets, kind of throw them together. That's why he stops and says, go to Daniel if you want to read more about this. I'm just kind of giving you a summary of what Daniel's talking about. So Matthew 24 is not about revealing a bunch of new information. It's about reminding them what they should already know from the Old Testament prophets. So a verse like verse 7, if you have this mindset, whenever you're reading in the New Testament, I say this here all the time, they get tired of it. When you're reading in the New Testament, especially prophecy, stop and think, where in the Old Testament is that mentioned first? And probably several times before it reaches the New Testament. So when you read the first part of verse 7, where in the Bible do you start thinking about? Well, immediately you start thinking about Daniel 2, the image of the man and all the successive empires. Daniel 7, all of those animals that represent the same pagan Gentile empires. And in those two visions, Daniel 2 and 7, he's looking way out into the future of these empires rising, conquering each other, and then another one comes along. And we know from history that took hundreds and hundreds of years as each one would succeed the other. This is what he's talking about. He's basically saying from this day on, from today, from the day he's talking, the same thing is going to be happening out there in the future. If you have nation rising against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, or empires against empires, are you talking about a short period of time or a very long period of time? And so even in this statement is kind of like a Another way of showing that the return of Christ is never said to be imminent in the New Testament. And that's a that's like the keystone belief of the pre-tribulation rapture, is that Jesus could return any minute. And when you ask, when did the any minute start? If they're being honest and consistent, they'll say he could have returned 1 minute after he left and not violated any scripture. Because imminence means imminence. Unless there's a starting point way out there in the future, then it's not imminent between that period of time, is it? And so when Jesus said something like verse 7, and he doesn't return until verse 30, after nation has risen against nation, after kingdom has risen against kingdom, would they have in their thinking, he might return really soon? Or based on their knowledge of the empires of the past, would they say, it's going to be a long time in the future before he comes back? Because all this takes a lot of time. So it would include the split of the Roman Empire into eastern and western legs. It would also include the Mongolian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, which is what the eastern leg developed into, the British Empire, where the sun never sets, the colonial empires carving up Africa and South America, Napoleon against most of Europe and Russia, the German during the 2 world wars, Japan in the Far East, China. I mean, on and on it goes. And so when you have this mindset that Jesus is basically referring to the same idea as Daniel 2 and Daniel 7, you realize he's not just saying it for saying its sake. He's saying that leading up to my return, there's going to be a whole lot of wars, empires rising, defeating others, nations against nations. It's going to be a long period of time, I think, is part of what he's trying to get at. But then in the last part of 7, there will be famines, pestilences, earthquakes in various places. So I say here that the signs on the earth, so we go back to the top where there's wonders in heaven above and signs in the earth beneath. So in both places. But the signs on the earth, such as pestilences, famines, earthquakes, other things we're going to look at, seem to be more during the entire course of the last 3.5 years. For instance, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, the first 4 seals, in Revelation 6, 1 through 8, that is during the 7 years, certainly. Much of it may happen maybe soon before the middle, some after. There's kind of an overlap of the seals and trumpets and bowls of wrath. But those are the signs on the earth. That's what's going to be happening on the earth. But the signs in the heavens in verse 29 of Matthew 24 seems to be right down at the end of the 7 years, at the return of Christ. In fact, this says immediately after the tribulation. And before, in Acts 2, quoting from Joel 2, he says it's before the day of the Lord. So, to get our terminology correct, when is the day of the Lord? Immediately after the tribulation. These cosmic signs happen. Peter says they happen before the day of the Lord. So we brought this up before. That may involve that whole 30 or 75-day period at the end of Daniel 12, where it is immediately after the tribulation, but it's before the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord is the actual return of Christ to defeat his enemies and set up his kingdom. Verse 8 says, all these are the beginning of sorrows. And I give you a little Greek lesson here that the word for sorrows is the Greek word Odin, which means birth pains. And we've looked at some of them through these sessions already in the past, that it's really, really common in the prophets, Jesus here, the Apostle Paul, in Romans, I give it, Romans 8:22. We'll look at that in a minute. But in 1 Thessalonians 5:3, let's turn and read that because it really gives the fuller idea of this word Odin. 1 Thessalonians 5:3. For when they say peace and safety, see, when they say, not us. Now, what is this particularly talking about? I think in literally or specifically, it's talking about that peace treaty that the Antichrist signs with Israel and the 10 nations aligned with him that has been fighting against Israel. I really believe they are so deceived by Antichrist, and he is such a charismatic figure that when he gets all of those warring parties to sign that peace treaty, I really think the world will say we finally have peace and safety. Now, we won't be saying that, but the world will. When they say peace and safety, then sudden destruction comes upon them as labor pains upon a pregnant woman. That labor pains is the same word translated sorrows in Matthew 24:8. So we know that labor pains build and build and build until the birth. So the tribulation period, especially the last 3.5 years, are described as building labor pain, bringing about, as we will see in Romans 8, deliverance. Don't we say when a baby's born, they're delivered? Well, Romans 8 uses that very word. The creation is waiting for its deliverance, its redemption. So when it says all these are the beginning of sorrows, I said it can mean the entire time between his ascension and return, because there has been birth pains or sorrows all along between his two comings. But it seems to have a special focus on the final 7 years, being the time of Jacob's trouble, or birth pains leading to new birth of creation, resurrection of the saints at his return, especially the last 3.5 years, because that's according, as we've looked at many times, 24:15, when you see the abomination of desolation, when and then, of verse 21, when and then. When you see it, then there shall be great tribulation. So those birth pains will really kick in the last 3.5 years, including, I will show wonders in heaven above, signs on the earth beneath. Thus many events in the heavens and on the earth will take place from God, but there will also, and this is interesting, be attempts to counterfeit those dramatic events by Antichrist. So let's read these verses. You know that the word anti, the prefix anti, the preposition, can mean against, or can mean instead of, as in counterfeit. And the Antichrist will try to copy many things about Christ for the purpose of deception. And in 2 Thessalonians 2:9 and 10, look at the wording of this. The coming of the lawless one, the Antichrist, is according to the working of Satan with all power, signs, and lying wonders. Now, the purpose of his signs and lying wonders is for unrighteous deception in verse 10. So at the same time, God is showing wonders in heaven and signs and wonders on the earth by all of the things he's pouring out through the seals and trumpets and bowls of wrath. Evidently, Antichrist will be also doing major things to try to imitate what God is doing. Because the last thing Antichrist wants is for people to conclude God is in control. And so by imitating what God is doing, it will add to the deception. As I say here, at the end of that paragraph, people will be asking, is this from God that's happening around us, or is this powerful ruler, is he using it against Israel and the saints, and we're seeing it too? And who's is it from God? Is it from him? Who is it from? What's the purpose of it? Then Revelation 13, in verse 13 and 14. He performs great signs. So this is interesting to me. This is talking about not the antichrist, but the false prophet, isn't it? Why is that interesting? Because we're going to read in just a minute. Who else is around doing great signs and wonders and miracles on the earth? The two witnesses. So there are two, whether you make them individuals or groups or whatever, but there's two doing great miracles. There are two counterfeit, the Antichrist and false prophet, also doing what will at least look like great miracles. Trying to counterfeit, trying to imitate, trying to show God and show the two witnesses we can do the same kind of things. Thus deceiving the world into not giving God the credit he deserves for being so powerful. He performs great signs so that he even makes fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men. Now, what does our very top verse say from Acts 2:19 and Joel 2:30? I will show wonders in heaven above and signs in the earth beneath, blood and fire and vapor of smoke. This guy's calling fire down from heaven too. So to some degree, he's imitating what the two witnesses are able to do. And he deceives those who dwell on the earth by those signs. So he's using his signs for deception. God's using his powers, especially through the two witnesses, to try to get people to repent and for judgment. He deceives those who dwell on the earth by those signs which he was granted to do in the sight of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image to the beast. So we went over that last time, which was a real interesting discussion. He doesn't make the image. He tells the high-tech people to make the image. He says, this is what I want. You figure out how to make it. You produce it. And I want it to be able to speak. And I want it to be so AI that they won't know it's AI. They'll think it's a person. I went to 3M in Minneapolis a few years ago, and they had one of these. I should have looked. I forgot what's the name of it. Hologram. Yeah, hologram. So they sponsored a NASCAR racer that year, and so they had a copy of his NASCAR race car, and then they had a hologram of him standing in front of the car. And obviously, you could tell it was a hologram if you looked at it. But when you first came around the corner, it was close enough to him that it looked like him. You could have been fooled at first. Well, that was 10 years ago. How far advanced has technology come since then? So the false prophet through the Antichrist is going to say, you guys create something that looks like it's human and it can speak. And it has enough power about it that people are going to be forced to worship it. So what he's going to be able to do will appear to be as powerful as what God is doing, at least to the average person. They won't be able to see the difference. And then I said, this is not even including what man will do to each other and to the earth with the weapons. So that's like a third thing about what's going on, is that man's going to be trying to destroy himself with weapons and wars and everything else during some of that time at least. And then, as well as the miraculous, so let's let's go look at Revelation 11. How much power do the two witnesses have? Well, it says in verse 5, if anyone wants to harm them, fire. There's that fire again. Fire from heaven, fire from the false prophet, fire from the two witnesses. There's a whole lot of fire going on. Proceeds from their mouth, devours their enemies. That's quite a bit of power. If anyone wants to harm them, he must be killed in this manner. They have power to shut heaven so that no rain falls in the days of their prophecy. They have power over waters to turn them into blood, to strike the earth with all plagues as often as they desire. So from multiple sources, major things are happening, and everybody's wondering, I don't understand any of it. And so, of course, what that causes is what fear causes, huh? It just causes people to shut down. It causes people to run and hide. So I want to bring up something that you may throw rotten eggs at me, because this is non-conservative Christianity. This is non-missionary Baptist, that's for sure. At the end of that paragraph, I said, we should not see ourselves as cessationists. You know what that means? Okay, the miraculous powers of the New Testament, speaking in tongues and healing of the sick and all that, we normally say that we are cessationists, meaning once the Bible was completed, those miraculous gifts ended. And they're not for our day today. But the charismatic movement, the Pentecostals and other charismatic groups that are growing and thriving today in many ways are saying, no, we are successionists or continuous. Those gifts have continued, and we're practicing those gifts. We're speaking in tongues, we're healing the sick. So there's this battle between the two views. But I really think the correct position is we are suspensionists, meaning, as I said here, Acts 2:16 through 21 will come roaring back during the tribulation, before the return of Christ and the millennial. Certainly there will be things that in our day would be considered miraculous happening on a regular basis in the millennial. But I'm talking about before that, before our resurrection, before our glorified bodies. Certainly these two witnesses, whoever they are, have miraculous powers. Certainly the antichrist and false prophet have, at least, whether it's false or true, it's going to be seen as miraculous powers. God's going to be opening the seals, the trumpets, the bowls of wrath. Great natural disasters are happening from God's hand. And so I call myself now a suspensionist, because a certain degree of that first century miraculous power will return. Many people have the two witnesses as the Holy Spirit in the church. I have a hard time getting there. It seems to be two individuals. They are actually killed, left in the street. So it depends if you want to take how literal you want to take that. But I teach the church will still be here. So to some degree, those two witnesses represent the saints. They're on the same side as the saints. And the saints will be given some of that same power. You know, that passage in I give here, Acts 2:16 to 21, is a quote from Joel 2, and that's the one where it says, your young men shall prophesy, they shall dream dreams, they shall speak in other languages, they shall, then it goes on to talk about the, what I quoted, I shall show wonders in heaven above, signs in the earth beneath. It seems like true and false miracles will come back. And I say that partly on the basis of if the leaders have that kind of power, then in some way the people following them will have a degree of that power, both good and evil people. The two witnesses and the antichrist and false prophet, and the people that follow each of them or are aligned with them will have some of that power also. Suspensionists. So think about that. When Jesus said in Matthew 24 and 29, this is really getting to this, that was the build up to this that I need to get to real quick. When he says in Matthew 24 and 29, I make this mistake. I think most others make this mistake. We read verses 29 through 31 as a unit, as a group together, and they are. And so because of that, we emphasize the sun, the moon, and the stars. We emphasize the Son of Man will appear. They'll see the Son of Man coming. We emphasize 31. He sent his angels, great sound of a trumpet, gather. So we emphasize all the different parts of it. And we tend to neglect or overlook one of the most important statements in this passage at the end of verse 29. The powers of heaven will be shaken. Now, what are the powers of heaven? That's just not the sun, moon, and stars. That's spirit powers. Ephesians 6:12, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, spiritual wickedness in high places. If what is happening, and I think this is a correct description of what is happening, the mystery of iniquity and the mystery of godliness are both on a collision course heading toward the end of the 7 years. And as they go along, they're both clashing with each other, growing in power and demonstration of what they can accomplish on the earth. And the spirit powers in heaven are being shaken because they are coming to an understanding. We may lose this all-out battle because there's some kind of power at work here that's beyond our power. I think they're beginning to notice that as the 7 years start coming to an end. You're going to have to read the Romans 8:19-22. We've read it before about the whole creation groans and travails. You're going to need to read Hebrews 12:25-29 on your own, where he talks about he's going to shake all things. That's from Haggai 2, verse 6 and 7. And the kingdom's going to remain after everything is shaken. Because I want to get to that next paragraph underlined part. All of this will lead to dramatic topographical changes on the earth. I think probably to the same degree as Noah's flood caused. Noah's flood, if you can imagine cajillion, trillion, billions, whatever it would be, gallons of water that was on the earth, and then the rotation of the earth and its orbit and all, the movement, gravity was like not just the weight, but it was changing everything. And when he said that the windows of heaven were opened, as I told Liberty a Sunday morning, I think, these recent really, really heavy rainstorms for like 10 minutes we had with hail and everything, is like, man, I didn't know it could rain that hard around here. Well, in 10 minutes, our backyard was flooded. What would 24 hours straight of that be? Well, it would probably be disaster. What would 40 days and 40 nights of that be? And then the fountains of the deep were opened. Well, how were they opened? Underground rivers and lakes. Earthquakes, probably. Volcanoes, causing tidal waves. I don't know if anyone lasted more than a day. We tend to think, they kept climbing up the higher and higher mountains. It's raining too hard for them to even breathe, probably. So I think they may have died within the first 24 hours. That's just kind of my feeling when you stop and think about it. But I think that the topography of the earth will change to the same degree or close to the same degree as the flood in Noah's day. So turn over to Zechariah 14 with me. Real interesting statements over there. Get rid of that. Zechariah 14:4. And in that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which faces Jerusalem on the east. The Mount of Olives shall be split in two. Well, do we take that literally? A mountain split in two? Well, if you take a mountain surrounded by other mountains and valleys, if you split that mountain in two, you're not just splitting that mountain in two, you're affecting everything within many miles of that mountain. So you can't just think of as, okay, this mountain split in two and it didn't affect anything around it. It's going to affect everything around it. From the east to the west, making a very large valley. Well, what's a very large valley? So, okay, I take that to mean it's not going to split 3 feet in two. If it's going to create a very large valley, it's going to split what? 100 yards in between or 200 yards? A very large valley, is it miles? Half of the mountain shall move toward the north, half of it toward the south. Big enough they can flee through it. And then down in verse 8, well, let's read verse 10 first. And the land shall be turned into a plain from Geba, which is about 5 to 6 miles north of Jerusalem, to Rimmon, south of Jerusalem, which is about 34 or 35 miles south of Jerusalem. So 40, there's a good Bible number. A 40-mile elevated plain. 40 miles. Andy's been to Israel. Ruth, have you been to Israel?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Gary, you guys been to Israel, haven't you? Yeah, okay. Anyway, lots of mountains and valleys. Hardly, not too much level land. But think of an elevated plain, 40 miles. It doesn't say how wide it is, but say 10 miles wide, 40 miles long, elevated plain. What's it going to take to bring that about in that land? What kind of earthquakes? What kind of changes? And does that represent changes elsewhere also? By the way, that size of elevated plain from Geba to Rimmon, they say is considered to be the northernmost and southernmost boundaries of the tribe of Judah in the land grant. Isn't that interesting? The elevated plain is going to be the exact size of Judah's land allotment. I find that really interesting. Jerusalem shall be raised up and inhabited in her place from Benjamin's gate to the place of the first gate, the corner gate, the tower, so on and so forth. Well, then go back to verse 8. In that day it shall be that living waters shall flow from Jerusalem. How are living waters going to flow from Jerusalem? What's going to be on a 40-mile? It doesn't say how high it's going to be. Say it's a mile high. Plain, if it's 10 miles wide, I don't know how wide it is, but what does that remind you of living waters flowing down from an elevated plain? The Garden of Eden. This is going to be like the Garden of Eden. Half of them toward the eastern sea, half of them toward the western sea. I give references. Let's turn to Revelation 6. I'll let you read most of these on your own. Revelation 6, and depending on how you have the seals and trumpets and bowls lined up, I have them with a lot of overlap. I have the 6th seal actually the same as the 7th trumpet and the 6th bowl of wrath right at the end. The description is exactly the same as the others at the end of their number. I looked when he opened the 6th seal, and behold, there was a great earthquake. The sun became black as sackcloth hair. The moon became like blood. So that's, description of at the end. The stars of heaven fell to the earth as a fig tree drops slate figs. shaken by a mighty wind. The sky receded as a scroll when it is rolled up. Every mountain and island was moved out of its place. The kings of the earth, the great men, the rich men, the commanders, the mighty men, every slave, every free, hid themselves in the caves and the rocks. The mountains said to the mountains and rocks, fall on us, hide us from the face. As I said before, heaven is open and they can actually see him getting ready to come back. Hide us. They want to die rather than see his face up there, who sits on the throne from the wrath of the Lamb, for the great day of his wrath, which I think his wrath is right down there at the end of the 7 years and really doesn't cover the entirety of the 7 years. Who is able to stand? So the references to great earthquakes, and I give 4 or 5 different passages here in Revelation, causing many tsunamis. Revelation 16:20 talks about the islands fled away. And then in the chapter 8 of like verse 5, the angel took the censer, filled it with fire from the altar, threw it to the earth. There were noises, thunderings, lightnings, and earthquakes. So all sorts of things going on, natural disasters. 8:12, the fourth angel sounded, a third of the sun was struck, a third of the moon, a third of the stars, a third of them were darkened, a third of the day did not shine, likewise the night. So this, back to this pillars of smoke. Is it nuclear? Zechariah 14 talks about their skin, their eyes melting in their bodies. Is it meteors? Does God send a few meteors to the earth? Is it volcanoes? Is it some of each? No doubt. If there are great earthquakes and great tsunamis, there's probably great volcanoes as well. If you look at the 7 trumpets, they're very similar to the plagues in Egypt. God said about those plagues in Egypt in Exodus 12:12, against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. Isn't that what the Great Tribulation is again? He's executing judgment on the gods of this world, on humanism, on rebels, and everything that is against him. Then that last paragraph, the added extremely frightful cosmic signs in the heavens of 24:29. And then I give Old Testament passages where it is drawn from, Jesus basically quoting Isaiah 13. New Testament passages like Luke 21:25, which causes 21:26, the powers of heaven will be shaken. 21:25 we looked at is the sea and the waves roaring. So I say again, it's not only physical, but spiritual powers that are being shaken. But the church will be there, being martyred, but also preaching the gospel. Revelation 12:11, they loved not their lives to the death. They had the testimony of God. They kept the commandments of Jesus Christ. They overcame him by the blood of the Lamb, by the word of their testimony, did not love their lives to the death. So both are going to be happening. They're going to be martyred, but why are they going to be martyred? Because they're preaching. They're going to be bringing up things I brought up tonight. They're going to be telling people whatever the Antichrist and false prophet's able to do, he's doing it to deceive you. God's doing the same kind of things, hoping you repent. You better repent because you're going to be sorry if you don't. I mean, I really believe our message will be that clear, just that blunt. Why do we care? They're going to kill us, so what? You know, I really think our boldness, I think the grace will be there. I think none of it will matter because perfect love casts out fear. And I really think we will be in a state of perfect love for the Lord if we're alive during that time. A verse that's often quoted at funerals, but if you look at the wording, it's talking about the people of that time. 14:13 of Revelation. I heard a voice from heaven saying to me, "Write, blessed are the dead who die on the Lord from now on." See, we quote this and we talk about anyone who's died at any time in history. He's talking about a special blessing to those who die in the Lord from now on. Who is this? The group in Revelation 20, verse 4. They sat on thrones, ruling and reigning with Christ, who were beheaded for not taking the mark of the beast. So there'll be plenty of martyrs, but there'll be others to take their place. And a special blessing is given to those who die from that point on. And then two quick verses, because I've never brought this thought up before. In 1 Thessalonians 4:15 and 17, the phrase is used twice, we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the air to meet the Lord in the air. So shall we ever be at the Lord. That word remain, I did a little word study on it. It really carries the idea of survive. Those who are alive and survive. Survive what? Revelation 13:7. It was granted to him to make war against the saints and to overcome them. Not completely, but to such a degree it's going to look like he's wiping them off the face of the earth. And so those who are alive and survive might be a better way of quoting that verse. So I call it our greatest outreach ever. There'll be much grace and boldness. It will be the church's finest hour. I'm probably, if I preach whatever number of years or months or days the Lord gives me to preach on these kind of things, and if I continue to see things as I now see them, people are going to get tired of hearing me say it will be the church's finest hour. But I hope to repeat it often because I want to offset this idea that we're going to be scared and running for our lives and hiding in the caves and don't catch me, and oh no, I'm going to starve. I don't want to take the mark of the beast. I'm hungry. And this picture of the saints during that time is like being weak and cowardly. And no, they're going to be bold and strong and brave and clear in their message. And you want to kill me? Kill me. But here's what's going to happen. And you're a fake Christ, and you deserve to be cast into hell. And that's what's going to happen to you when Jesus comes back. I really think we'll be just about that direct. So Joel 3:16, I like this one. The Lord will roar, the Lion of the tribe of Judah. The Lord will roar from Zion. The heavens and earth will shake. And I think one of our main messages in the midst of all that is pray that the Lord shake your heart to repent of your sins and trust in him before it is literally too late.